A clinical trial was conducted to see if Oncotype DX, which is a genomic test, could benefit patients, that information could help physicians make decisions about treatment, not just give us information about what your genes are doing. Last July, at the annual meeting of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, the results of the trial were presented to thousands of physicians, researchers, and patient advocates, and the results were very exciting. Our chief scientific advisor, George Sledge, who is a professor of medicine and pathology and the chief of the Division of Oncology at Stanford University, was closely involved in the trial, and we'd like to hear him say a few words on it.
So breast cancer doctors have known for a very long time that we overtreat with chemotherapy. A little over a decade ago, we started to have genomic studies that allowed us to figure out which populations of women might or might not benefit from chemotherapy. And this led to the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group working with other cooperative groups in North America to run a trial called the TAILORx trial. When we started, we were not really sure whether or not it would fly, because we were asking women to come into a trial whether they would either receive chemotherapy or no chemotherapy. The advocacy community, and Komen in particular, were strongly supportive of this trial, believing that it would answer a crucial question and that in the long term would benefit large numbers of women. And the trial results basically say that if a woman is over the age of 50 and has an intermediate recurrence score, she gets no benefit from the addition of chemotherapy to hormonal therapy. TAILORx is a real win for women with breast cancer. It shows what you can do with a large cooperative group trial that's supported by advocacy groups. Over the next few years, this will result in tens of thousands of women not having to receive chemotherapy for early stage breast cancer.
So just to recap, the TAILORx trial was independently designed and conducted by a collaborative group, sponsored by the National Cancer Institute, and was the largest adjuvant, which is a treatment after surgery or your initial treatment, so the largest adjuvant breast cancer treatment trial ever conducted. It enrolled over 10,000 women with early stage breast cancer across approximately 1,200 sites in the United States and 5 additional countries. That's an incredible number of people working together to get to this result. So what did they find out? According to researchers, the study definitively identifies the 30% of those women for whom chemotherapy can be life-saving and should definitely be included in their treatment, and the 70% of women with early stage, hormone receptor positive, ER positive, but HER2 negative women with breast cancer who do not benefit whatsoever from chemotherapy. That's outstanding. That's just amazing. So this important finding reveals that Oncotype DX, or a genomic test, can lead to a new level of precision treatment. So Dr. Russell, what does this mean for patients?
So let me step backwards and talk about the 21 gene test, because there's lots of different assays that are out there. So this is a 21 genes in the breast cancer are tested. It's the same 21 genes that are tested for every breast cancer. And the whole product's called Oncotype DX. And it is specific for testing of breast cancers that have an estrogen receptor and where the HER2 gene is normal or HER2 negative. And we have trials where when we found about the 21 genes, so they were discovered 17 plus years ago, and put together, that you have to go through a lot of different studies to see, okay, now we've discovered these 21 genes, we think they may be meaningful, but we need to figure out what to do.
Research takes a long time.
It
It just does not have, as much as we are aching for those discoveries, it just takes a long time.
The first publication of using these genes that gave us information was in 2004. And it said that for women who took tamoxifen for 5 years or didn't take tamoxifen for 5 years, that the score, which is on a 0 to 100 basis, can tell us how that woman's going to do after she's done with her 5 years of estrogen blocker. And so the higher the score on a 0 to 100 basis, looking at these 21 genes, the higher the risk that the breast cancer is going to come back somewhere else in the body. And we know that metastatic breast cancer, as far as we know, is not curable. So that's interesting. But then the real question is, I don't think it helps to say, well, you tell me I have to take endocrine therapy or tamoxifen for 5 years, and then you're going to do a test that tells me whether I'm going to die anyway. I don't want that test, right? Don't give me that test, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to make the test useful, clinically useful. So the real question is, does everybody get the same benefit from chemotherapy if their cancer's estrogen receptor positive, HER2 negative? And so they went through this study. There was a small study, 600 some women, run in the 1980s, where half the women got chemo and half did not, but everybody got tamoxifen. And it showed that the higher the recurrence score, that the more likely the patient was going to benefit from chemotherapy. And the lower the score, absolutely no benefit from chemotherapy. And at that time, we kind of had this intermediate group where we weren't quite sure whether they were benefiting from chemo or not, or what number of recurrence score on that 0 to 100 does chemotherapy benefit begin?
Well, it's really hard, right? Because we have so much information. How do we make it really useful in the clinic? That's
right.
Really tough.
So we all knew that, doing this retrospective look on 600 some patients it changed the standard of care, and people started to order this test. But that study was published in 2006. And people were starting to order the test, trying to make a decision whether to give chemotherapy or not. And there's a little bit of black and white, but there's a lot of gray that was in between. And so TAILORx was initiated by the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, we call that ECOG, but really paid for by the National Cancer Institute, and then multiple partners, including Komen, to ask the big question. Can we figure out at what recurrence score, 0 to 100, do you start to benefit from chemotherapy? And then we can leave all these patients behind and not even offer them chemotherapy. And if your score is above a certain level, we'll give them chemotherapy. So when the study was started in 2006, they planned to put 10,000 women into this study. And for women with this really low recurrence score, it was a little bit artificial how it was decided, but they said if your recurrence score is 0 to 10, you're just going to get an estrogen blocker. And if your score is 26 to 100, you have to take chemotherapy and your estrogen blocker. And if your score is 11 to 25,
that middle group that you don't know what to do with.
Don't know what to do with. We don't know where 11 to 25 chemotherapy benefit begins. You're going to have a computer randomly assign you to chemotherapy or not. And that was 6,700 of the 10,000 women.
So that's pretty intense. Dr. Sledge talked about how nervous everyone was to ask somebody to say, don't take chemotherapy. Because as bad as it is, if you're a breast cancer patient, you think you need to have it. And we'll hear a little bit more about that later. But that was pretty intense.
I think the 10,000 women who agreed to go into this trial are heroes.
They're amazing.
Right?
So I'm so amazed with anyone who participates in clinical
And
trials.
there were a lot of women who refused to go into the trial. They either said, I have to have chemotherapy, or I'm never taking chemotherapy, so don't put me into a trial because I'm not going to accept chemotherapy. And so, to let a computer decide whether you're going to get chemotherapy or not is
very brave.
Oh, it is so tough. And so, but 6,700 women did agree to it finally. And between 2006 and 2010, we accrued the 10,000 women. And then we start to wait. And what are we waiting for? We're waiting for women to see if they're going to develop metastasis. And
hopefully we're waiting forever.
A long time. And they looked at other things too. Did they die from something else, or did they get some other kind of cancer while we're waiting, or did they get a cancer in the other breast? Or if their breast was left in place, they just had a lumpectomy, did they get another cancer in that breast? There's lots of different things we looked at. And we looked at whether the score gave us that information. So we had to have 894 events before we were allowed to report the results of the study. And we thought it would take maybe from 2010, maybe to 2014, 2015 before there were enough events. And it took much longer.
It always takes longer.
But that's good. That means women weren't having events.
We're never getting
right.
Great.
So 2018, they said there are 895 events. Go ahead and report the data. And that's why it got reported at the ASCO meeting in June of this year, 2018. So, great. So we have 10,000 women. What do we know about those women who got the endocrine therapy for 5 years? We know with a really low recurrence score, 0 to 10, at 9 years of follow-up, that 3% of them have developed metastasis despite having taken their endocrine therapy, but chemo would never have benefited them. And we know for those women who are 26 to 100, all of whom got chemotherapy and an estrogen blocker, really high recurrence scores, 13% of them have developed metastases.
So they were really at a high risk. So that difference is 0.3 to 13%. That's a big jump.
Correct. So, and that's getting everything,
Yeah.
right? You got chemo and your estrogen blocker,
still, yeah.
and you still had 13% at 9 years. But if they had not taken
It
chemotherapy,
would have been higher.
30 to 40% would have developed metastases. So
That's
we know
another
that
big
when
jump.
your score is really high, you absolutely, that is personalized medicine for that cancer. You have to give it chemotherapy. So the question is what happened in between for those
Right.
women with recurrence score 11 to 25. And what it showed was for the entire group of women, there was no chemotherapy benefit. And we thought that somewhere between 11 and 25, we were going to see the magic happen.
Yeah.
Where's the
Yeah.
chemo benefit begin? And we didn't see it. So the statisticians were like, well, we put 6,700 women into this trial, half got chemo and half did not. Where's the chemo benefit? And so the statisticians went back and said, let's look at that whole group of women and let's see if there's anybody in there who got chemotherapy benefit between 11 and 25. So they looked at things like the age of the patient or her menopause status or how big her cancer was or how aggressive it looks under the microscope, grading. And they found a very interesting thing, that young women, which is defined as 50 and younger,
Very young.
that's what I'm thinking, right? As long as you don't say over 50 is old,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
50 and younger who had a recurrence score between 11 and 25, that the higher that recurrence score was going between 11 and 25, you started to see the curve separate
Okay.
and you started to see chemotherapy benefit. And so,
And we know that in younger patients, the cancers tend to be more aggressive.
they tend to be, but if you know the recurrence score, it's
It helps.
not that aggressive.
Interesting.
It's the recurrence score for that
Interesting.
person. So we started to see the curve separate around 16 recurrence score. And for women who are over 50, up to a recurrence score of 25, no separation.
Mm-hmm.
So very different based on age. And we're not sure
Back to
why.
personalized medicine
It's very
again,
personalized,
right?
right?
So that gives you more information to make better. more
Based on a woman's
confidence.
age,
Yeah.
right? So now we know that it's very predictive of chemotherapy benefit starting in the mid-teens of recurrence score for young women, and that if their recurrence score is 15 and under, no chemotherapy benefit. And for older women, we think the chemotherapy benefit begins around 26, and then the curves will start to separate after that. So personalized by age, but absolutely personalized by what your recurrence score is. So the neat thing to me is, if you're over 50, only 15% of women have a recurrence score at 26 to 100. So we talk
Those are
about
good odds.
30% will need chemotherapy, but not if you're over 50. It's 15% will need chemotherapy.
Even better.
Yeah.
Even better.
If you are under 50, we're starting to think it's probably 25 to 30% of patients will get chemotherapy because of where their recurrence score is based on age. But so we know two things. If your recurrence score is low, you can't be messing around with your endocrine therapy. You have to take it. Your cancer has told us that it is very dependent upon that estrogen to grow, and we have to block it down. And if your recurrence score is high, it is absolutely dependent on chemotherapy to be killed off, but then we're going to complement it with an estrogen blocker as well. So neat to go from 100% of patients getting chemotherapy.
Because you were just
We-
guessing, we were just hoping that that
Correct.
would work,
We
right?
didn't
And now
know.
we know.
Now we
That's
know.
really great.
We know with such great definition. So then we always have the controversy. What if my number's on the bubble? What if my age is 50 or 49 or 51? All those issues. What a great problem to have.
Yeah.
To go from 100% getting chemotherapy to now a little bit of uncertainty. And now let's look at what you want. Let's do a lot of, discussion with the patients around what are your wishes and your goals? But we have so much science behind making the initial choice. Now let's hear what you want to do.